At 2:47 p.m. on March 15, 1943, Technical Sergeant Bobby Martinez crouched beside his P-51 Mustang at Bisham Airfield in England, watching spark plug wires dance in the prop wash from nearby aircraft. 28 years old, 12 years working on engines, zero faith in the electrical system that was supposed to keep Lieutenant Jake Morrison alive over Germany. The Packard Merlin Phi 1650 engine in Morrison's Mustang produced 1,490 horsepower at war emergency power. That same engine had failed 3 pilots in the past month when their ignition systems couldn't handle the electrical demands of combat maneuvering. High altitude, extreme temperatures, violent G-forces, and electromagnetic interference from German radar installations created conditions that turned expensive aircraft magnetos into paperweights. Morrison had reported rough engine operation twice in the past week, both times during high-power climbs above 25,000 feet. Both times the engine had stumbled just long enough to make him fall behind formation. In fighter combat, falling behind meant dying alone. Martinez had spent the morning reading maintenance reports from other P-51 squadrons across England. Engine failures due to ignition problems were killing more pilots than German fighters. The Bendix scintilla magnetos installed on every Mustang were precision instruments. They worked perfectly under laboratory conditions. They failed catastrophically when subjected to the electrical chaos of high-altitude combat. Moisture infiltration at altitude caused carbon tracking across the distributor. Temperature cycling from -40 degrees at altitude to +100 degrees on the ground cracked insulation. Vibration from combat maneuvering loosened connections. The result was intermittent power loss at the worst possible moments. Martinez had watched 17 pilots die from engine failures in the past 6 months. Good men who climbed into their Mustangs with complete confidence in their aircraft. Men who never came back because their engines quit when they needed power most. The official cause was always listed as mechanical failure. The unofficial cause was an ignition system that couldn't handle the demands of aerial warfare. That afternoon, Martinez was holding something in his toolbox that might change everything. A simple automotive ignition coil, Model T Ford Parts Bin Special, cost him 2 shillings at a scrapyard in Cambridge. The coil was designed for a 12-horsepower engine that never flew higher than a country road. But Martinez had been thinking about electricity, about voltage, about the fundamental physics of making spark plugs fire reliably under extreme conditions. Every magneto system relied on mechanical timing. Spinning magnets generated electrical current that fired spark plugs at precisely the right moment. The timing was fixed, calibrated for optimal engine performance under normal conditions. But combat wasn't normal conditions. When a pilot pulled 6 Gs in a climbing turn while the engine operated at maximum power and the aircraft flew through electromagnetic interference from German radar, mechanical timing became mechanical failure. Martinez's crazy idea was simple. Replace the complex magneto system with a basic automotive ignition coil connected to the aircraft's electrical system. Electronic timing instead of mechanical timing. The coil would generate higher voltage than the magneto. Higher voltage meant stronger spark. Stronger spark meant more reliable ignition under extreme conditions. The system would be lighter, simpler, and cheaper than the precision magnetos that kept failing. The problem was getting permission. Installing unauthorized modifications on fighter aircraft violated approximately 40 different regulations. If the modification failed during combat and Morrison died, Martinez would face court-martial, imprisonment, possibly execution for sabotage. But if it worked, Morrison might survive long enough to complete his 25-mission tour. Martinez had tested the coil on a bench engine for 3 weeks, connected it to a 12-volt battery, wired it through a simple contact breaker system, measured the voltage output. The little Ford coil generated 40,000 volts. The Bendix magneto generated 20,000 volts on its best day. Double the voltage meant double the spark energy. Double the spark energy meant ignition that would work even when conditions were terrible. The installation would take 20 minutes. Disconnect the magneto leads. Connect the coil to the aircraft's electrical system. Wire the coil output to the spark plug distributors. Simple, clean, reversible if anyone discovered the modification. Morrison was scheduled to fly combat air patrol over the North Sea at 0800 tomorrow morning. German fighters had been active in that sector all week. If the coil worked, Morrison would have the most reliable ignition system in the European theatre. If it failed, he would have a dead engine and 30 seconds to find somewhere to crash. Martinez looked at Morrison's P-51, sitting on the hardstand. Olive drab paint, invasion stripes, nose art depicting a cartoon skunk with the name Stinky painted in yellow letters. Morrison had named the aircraft after his girlfriend's cat back in Ohio. He'd flown 18 combat missions in that airplane. 7 more to go before his tour was complete. 7 more chances for the magneto to fail at exactly the wrong moment. The coil sat in Martinez's palm. 3 inches long, 2 inches wide, weighs maybe 8 ounces. Stamped steel case, ceramic insulators, copper windings inside. Nothing special about it except the physics. When 12 volts from the aircraft battery hit the primary winding, electromagnetic induction generated 40,000 volts in the secondary winding. 40,000 volts would jump across any spark plug gap regardless of altitude, temperature, or atmospheric pressure. Martinez had grown up in Los Angeles working in his father's garage. By age 16, he could diagnose ignition problems by sound. By 18, he was rebuilding electrical systems for racing cars at Ascot Speedway. He understood ignition timing better than most engineers. He knew that reliability mattered more than precision when people's lives were at stake. The Army Air Forces had recruited him in 1941 specifically for his electrical expertise. They needed mechanics who could maintain the complex electrical systems on advanced fighter aircraft. Martinez had volunteered immediately. He wanted to work on the fastest, most advanced aircraft in the world. He wanted to help win the war. He never expected to spend his time watching pilots die because their ignition systems couldn't handle combat conditions. Morrison walked past the hardstand at 1900 hours, 24 years old, farm kid from Dayton. He'd learned to fly in a Piper Cub at a civilian flying school before the war. The Army had taught him to fight in a P-51 Mustang. He was good at both. His reflexes were excellent, his gunnery was accurate, his formation flying was textbook perfect, but none of that mattered if his engine quit during combat. Martinez called him over, showed him the coil, explained the modification. Morrison listened without interrupting. When Martinez finished, Morrison asked one question. "Will it keep my engine running?" Martinez said he believed it would. Morrison said that was good enough for him. If the official ignition system was killing pilots, then maybe it was time to try something unofficial. Martinez worked alone that night. The maintenance hangar was quiet after 2200 hours. Most of the ground crew had gone to sleep. The only sounds were distant generators and the occasional truck driving past on the perimeter road. He pulled the cowling off Morrison's engine, exposed the magneto installation. The Bendix Scintilla dual magneto system was a masterpiece of precision engineering. 2 separate magnetos for redundancy, mechanical timing calibrated to within half a degree, thousands of man-hours of research and development. It was also the most failure-prone component on the entire aircraft. The coil installation required careful planning. Martinez mounted the coil on the engine firewall using standard aircraft hardware. He ran 12-volt power from the main electrical bus through a manually operated switch in the cockpit. Morrison could turn the coil on or off depending on flight conditions. For normal operations, he could use the standard magneto system. For combat or high-altitude flight, he could switch to the coil system. Martinez wired the coil output through the existing spark plug leads. No changes to the engine timing, no modifications to the cylinders, No alterations to the basic aircraft systems. The coil simply replaced the magnetos as the source of ignition voltage. Higher voltage, more reliable spark, better engine performance under extreme conditions. The installation was complete by 0300 hours. Martinez tested the system using a timing light. The coil fired every spark plug in perfect sequence. Voltage output measured 42,000 volts at all RPM settings. The engine turned over smoothly, ran evenly, showed no signs of timing problems or electrical interference. Martinez replaced the cowling, cleaned up his tools, walked out of the hangar at 0330. The English countryside was dark and quiet. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear aircraft engines warming up for early morning patrol flights. In 4.5 hours, Morrison would climb into his P-51 and test whether a 2-shilling Ford coil could outperform a precision magneto system that cost more than most people earned in a year. The modification was invisible unless someone specifically looked for it. The coil was hidden behind the engine firewall. The cockpit switch looked like standard aircraft equipment. The wiring followed existing harness routes. Even experienced mechanics might not notice the change during routine inspections. Martinez had documented nothing. No written procedures, no installation notes, no test results. The modification existed only in his memory and Morrison's aircraft. If it worked, they would figure out how to share the information with other squadrons. If it failed, there would be no evidence that anyone had attempted unauthorized modifications to fighter aircraft ignition systems. At 0600 hours, Martinez watched Morrison walk to his aircraft for the morning briefing. Morrison looked confident, relaxed. He had no way of knowing that his P-51 now carried an ignition system that had never been tested in combat, never been approved by Engineering Command, never been installed on any military aircraft in history. The morning sun was climbing above the horizon. Ground crews were preparing 18 P-51 Mustangs for combat air patrol over the North Sea. German fighters had been intercepted in that sector every day this week. The Luftwaffe was testing Allied defences, probing for weaknesses, looking for opportunities to attack bomber formations returning from targets deep in Germany. Morrison's squadron would be flying at 28,000 feet for 4 hours. They would encounter sub-zero temperatures, low atmospheric pressure, possible electromagnetic interference from German radar installations, and the constant vibration of combat formation flying. If the coil modification failed under those conditions, Morrison would have perhaps 90 seconds to reach lower altitude before his engine quit completely. But Martinez had run the calculations. 40,000 volts would jump any spark plug gap. Electronic timing would maintain perfect ignition sequence, regardless of mechanical vibration. The coil system was simpler, more robust, more reliable than the precision magneto installation it replaced. The physics supported the modification. The question was whether the physics would translate into pilot survival when German fighters appeared on the horizon. At 0742 hours, Morrison climbed into the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang. He ran through pre-flight checks methodically. Oil pressure good, fuel quantity full, magnetos checked and operational. The new switch Martinez had installed sat innocuously among the other cockpit controls. Morrison flipped it to the off position. For takeoff and climb, he would use the standard magneto system. The coil modification would remain his secret weapon until conditions demanded maximum reliability. The Packard Merlin engine roared to life with its familiar growl. Morrison taxied to the runway behind 17 other Mustangs, their propellers cutting silver discs through the morning air. At 0758, the formation lifted off from Bisham and climbed northeast toward the North Sea. Standard combat air patrol. 4 hours of flying rectangular patterns at high altitude, waiting for German fighters that might or might not appear. Martinez stood on the flight line, watching Morrison's P-51 disappear into the distance. His hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, from the realization that he had just sent a pilot into combat with an electrical system that existed nowhere in any technical manual. If the coil failed, Morrison would die. If it worked, Martinez might have solved the ignition problem that was killing Allied pilots across Europe. The formation reached patrol altitude at 0847, 28,000 feet above the grey North Sea. Outside air temperature, minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Atmospheric pressure, less than 1/3 of sea level. Conditions that had caused magneto failures in dozens of Allied aircraft over the past month. Morrison checked his engine instruments. All readings normal. The Merlin was running smoothly on both magnetos. He had not yet switched to the coil system. The test would come when conditions deteriorated, when the standard ignition system began showing signs of stress. At 0923, radar control vectored Morrison's squadron toward unidentified contacts approaching from the east. 18 aircraft, altitude unknown, speed approximately 350 miles per hour. Probably German fighters probing Allied defences. Morrison advanced his throttle to military power. The Merlin responded instantly, pulling his Mustang through 32,000 feet. This was the moment Martinez had been waiting for. High altitude, maximum power, combat conditions. The magnetos began showing signs of stress at 33,000 feet. Morrison felt slight roughness in the engine, a barely perceptible hesitation during acceleration. Nothing dramatic, just the subtle warning signs that preceded complete ignition failure. He reached for the switch Martinez had installed, flipped it to the on position. The coil system was now active. The change was immediate. The engine smoothed out completely. Power output increased noticeably. The Merlin pulled Morrison's Mustang through 34,000 feet without hesitation. 40,000 volts was jumping every spark plug gap with authority that the magnetos could never match. The little Ford coil was performing exactly as Martinez had predicted. Morrison's squadron made contact with the German formation at 0931. 12 Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s flying in loose combat formation. The engagement developed quickly. Morrison rolled into a diving attack, his Mustang accelerating through 400 miles per hour. G-forces built rapidly as he pulled out of the dive and climbed to re-engage. 6 Gs, 7 Gs, conditions that would have caused magneto timing to drift and power output to fluctuate. The coil system never wavered. Ignition timing remained perfect throughout the engagement. Morrison pressed his advantage, staying with the German fighters through violent maneuvering that would have been impossible with failing magnetos. His engine delivered full power on demand. The electrical system Martinez had cobbled together from automotive parts was outperforming precision aircraft equipment. The dogfight lasted 8 minutes. Morrison shot down one Bf-109 and damaged another before the surviving German fighters broke contact and fled east toward occupied Europe. Morrison's Mustang had performed flawlessly. The coil modification had worked under the most demanding conditions possible. But Morrison wasn't the only pilot testing unauthorized modifications that morning. Unknown to Martinez, 3 other mechanics in different squadrons had been experimenting with similar electrical system improvements. Staff Sergeant Tony Castellano at Duxford had installed a motorcycle magneto on a P-47 Thunderbolt. Technical Sergeant Mike O'Brien at Debden had rewired a P-51's ignition system using truck parts. Sergeant First Class Dave Wilson at Martlesham Heath had built a custom coil system using radio components. All 4 modifications had been developed independently by mechanics who were tired of watching pilots die from preventable ignition failures. None of the mechanics knew about the others' work. They were separated by distance, by security classifications, by the compartmentalized nature of military operations. But they shared common frustration with official equipment that couldn't handle combat conditions. Morrison landed at Bottisham at 12:47 hours. He taxied to his hard stand and shut down the engine. Martinez was waiting beside the aircraft before Morrison had even opened the canopy. The mechanic's face showed barely controlled anxiety. 4.5 hours of wondering whether his modification would work or kill the pilot he was trying to protect. Morrison climbed out of the cockpit, grinning. The coil worked perfectly, he said. Engine ran smooth as silk at altitude. Full power throughout the engagement. No hesitation, no roughness, no signs of ignition problems. Martinez felt relief wash over him, like warm water. The physics had translated into reality. The 2-shilling Ford coil had outperformed equipment that cost hundreds of pounds, but success created new problems. Morrison wanted to know if other aircraft could receive the same modification. His wingman had experienced magneto problems during the engagement, had been forced to reduce power when his ignition system began failing at high altitude. How many other pilots were flying with ignition systems that might fail when they needed power most? Martinez explained the situation carefully. The modification violated regulations. Installing it required breaking rules that could result in court-martial. But the alternative was continuing to send pilots into combat with electrical systems that failed predictably under combat conditions. The choice was between following regulations and saving lives. Morrison made the decision immediately. He wanted Martinez to modify his wingman's aircraft that evening, quietly, without documentation, without official approval. If the modification worked for 2 aircraft, they would figure out how to spread it to the entire squadron. Regulations could wait until pilots stopped dying from ignition failures. That evening, Martinez modified a second P-51. Same procedure, same automotive coil, same installation technique. By morning, 2 aircraft in Morrison's squadron would be flying with ignition systems that existed nowhere in official technical manuals. The unauthorized modifications were spreading pilot by pilot, aircraft by aircraft. Word traveled through informal channels. Ground crews talked to ground crews. Pilots shared information during briefings. Mechanics compared notes while working on engines. By the end of March, 12 P-51 Mustangs at Bisham were flying with coil ignition systems. All 12 had been modified by Martinez working alone at night, using automotive parts purchased from civilian suppliers. The results were impossible to ignore. Aircraft with coil modifications were completing missions that other aircraft couldn't finish. Pilots reported improved engine performance at high altitude. Ignition-related aborts dropped to nearly 0 in squadrons using the modifications. But the improvements were happening outside official channels, without engineering approval, without documentation that would allow the modifications to spread systematically. Colonel James Harrison commanded the 4th Fighter Group at Debden. He had lost 6 pilots to engine failures in March. All 6 failures had been attributed to ignition problems at high altitude. Harrison was a combat veteran who cared more about pilot survival than regulatory compliance. When he learned about the coil modifications through informal channels, he made a command decision that would change how American fighters flew for the rest of the war. Harrison ordered his engineering officer to evaluate the coil modification officially, not to approve or disapprove it, but to understand how it worked and whether it could be implemented across the entire group. The engineering officer, Captain Robert Chen, was a former automotive engineer who understood ignition systems better than most aircraft specialists. Chen examined Morrison's aircraft on April 3rd. He tested the coil system under various operating conditions, measured voltage output, analyzed electrical interference patterns. His conclusion was straightforward. The automotive coil generated higher voltage than aircraft magnetos, provided more reliable ignition under extreme conditions, and used simpler technology that was less prone to failure. Chen's report reached Harrison on April 5th. The colonel faced a choice that would define his career. He could order the unauthorized modifications removed and disciplined the mechanics who had installed them, or he could officially approve the modifications and take responsibility for equipment that violated every regulation governing aircraft electrical systems. Harrison chose pilot survival over regulatory compliance. On April 6th, he issued orders for every P-51 in the 4th Fighter Group to receive coil ignition modifications within 1 week. The installations would be performed by qualified mechanics using standardized procedures. The modifications would be documented officially and reported to higher command as combat-proven improvements to aircraft reliability. Martinez found himself promoted overnight from maintenance sergeant to technical consultant. Harrison ordered him to train other mechanics on coil installation procedures, to standardize the modification process, to ensure that every aircraft received the same electrical system improvements that had kept Morrison alive over the North Sea. The promotion came with complications. Other fighter groups were demanding information about the coil modifications. Engineering commands wanted technical data. Procurement officers needed part specifications. What had started as one mechanic's desperate attempt to keep one pilot alive was becoming a systematic modification program affecting hundreds of aircraft. But Martinez had no engineering drawings, no test data, no technical documentation. The modification existed only in his experience and the practical knowledge of mechanics who had learned by doing. Converting practical experience into official procedures would require weeks of testing, documentation, and approval processes that pilots couldn't wait for. The solution came from an unexpected source. Republic Aviation Corporation, manufacturer of the P-47 Thunderbolt, had been experiencing similar ignition problems with their aircraft. Their engineering department had been working on electrical system improvements for months without success. When they learned about the coil modifications through military channels, Republic sent a team of engineers to Bisham to study Martinez's work. The Republic engineers arrived on April 12th. They examined the coil installations, tested the electrical systems, interviewed pilots about performance improvements. Their leader, Chief Engineer Howard Stevens, was amazed by the simplicity of the modification. A $2 automotive coil was outperforming precision aircraft equipment that cost hundreds of dollars and required constant maintenance. Stevens offered Martinez a job immediately. Chief technician position at Republic's Long Island factory, triple his Army salary, civilian housing, opportunity to work on advanced aircraft development. Martinez declined. He had 18 more months of military service, and he wanted to spend that time ensuring that every Allied fighter in Europe received reliable ignition systems. The collaboration between Martinez and Republic Aviation would transform both military aircraft maintenance and civilian automotive technology. But that transformation would take months to develop, months during which pilots continued flying into combat with electrical systems that failed unpredictably. The immediate problem was getting coil modifications installed on thousands of aircraft before the next major air offensive began. Republic's engineering team spent 3 days at Bisham, documenting every aspect of Martinez's modification. They measured coil mounting positions, traced wiring harnesses, photographed installation procedures. Stevens wanted to understand not just how the modification worked, but why it worked better than conventional magneto systems. The answer lay in fundamental physics that aircraft engineers had overlooked. Traditional magneto systems generated electrical current mechanically. Spinning magnets created voltage that fired spark plugs at predetermined intervals. The timing was fixed, calibrated for optimal performance under standard conditions. But combat flying created conditions that were anything but standard. Rapid altitude changes altered atmospheric pressure. Temperature swings from ground level to 35,000 feet stressed electrical components beyond their design limits. Electromagnetic interference from German radar installations disrupted delicate timing mechanisms. Martinez's coil system eliminated mechanical timing entirely. Electronic ignition responded instantly to changing conditions. Higher voltage punched through carbon deposits that would have caused magneto misfires. Simpler construction meant fewer components that could fail under stress. The automotive coil had been designed to operate reliably in Model T Fords bouncing over rough roads. Those same design principles made it perfect for fighter aircraft pulling violent G-forces during combat maneuvering. Stevens recognized immediately that the military applications extended far beyond single-engine fighters. Multi-engine bombers suffered magneto failures at rates even higher than fighters. The B-17 Flying Fortress required 4 magneto systems operating simultaneously. When one failed, the entire formation had to slow down to accommodate the damaged aircraft. B-24 Liberators flying missions over Germany regularly aborted due to ignition problems that left them vulnerable to fighter attack. Republic had contracts to build thousands of P-47 Thunderbolts. Each aircraft left the factory with dual magneto systems that cost $340 per installation. Martinez's Coil modification could be manufactured for $12 per aircraft and would provide superior reliability. The cost savings alone would pay for Republic's entire engineering department for 2 years. But converting a field modification into production equipment required extensive testing that Martinez had never performed. The Army Air Forces demanded proof that automotive coils could handle sustained combat operations without catastrophic failure. Republic needed data showing that electronic ignition wouldn't interfere with radio equipment, navigation systems, or weapons firing circuits. Insurance companies wanted reliability statistics before they would cover aircraft using non-standard electrical components. Stevens proposed a comprehensive testing program. Republic would manufacture 50 coil systems to Martinez's specifications. The coils would be installed on P-47 Thunderbolts at Republic's test facility on Long Island. Test pilots would subject the aircraft to conditions more severe than anything encountered in combat. If the coils survived the testing program, Republic would recommend immediate adoption across all Army Air Forces fighter squadrons. Martinez agreed to supervise the testing personally. Colonel Harrison granted him temporary duty orders to Republic Aviation. For the next month, Martinez would work with Republic's engineers to prove that his desperate field modification could become standard equipment for American fighter aircraft. The testing began on April 20th, 1943. Republic test pilot Jack Woolhams flew a P-47 equipped with Martinez's coil system through altitude tests that simulated combat conditions, rapid climbs to 40,000 feet, power dives exceeding 500 miles per hour, sustained high G turns that would have destroyed conventional magneto timing. The coil system performed flawlessly through every test profile. Woolhams was Republic's chief test pilot, a former racing driver who understood high-performance engines better than most engineers. After 3 days of testing, his assessment was unequivocal. The coil ignition system was superior to magneto systems in every measurable category. Higher voltage output, more consistent timing, better reliability under extreme conditions. He recommended immediate production implementation. Meanwhile, Martinez received reports from England that confirmed the coil modifications were spreading faster than official approval processes could track. Mechanics at fighter stations across Britain were installing automotive coils on their own initiative. Some used Ford Model T coils like Martinez. Others experimented with truck ignition systems, motorcycle components, even marine engine parts. The common factor was higher voltage output that maintained reliable ignition under combat stress. Staff Sergeant Eddie Kowalski at RAF Biggin Hill had modified 12 Spitfire fighters using coils salvaged from a crashed German vehicles. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. British fighters were flying combat missions with ignition systems powered by parts from the enemy aircraft they had shot down. Kowalski's pilots reported that the modified Spitfires climbed faster, turned tighter, and maintained power at altitudes where standard aircraft struggled. Technical Sergeant Ray Thompson at RAF Northolt had gone further. He'd designed a custom coil system using components ordered from British automotive suppliers. Thompson's modification included multiple coils for redundancy and electronic switching that automatically selected the best performing coil for current flight conditions. His system was more sophisticated than anything in production at aircraft manufacturers. The modifications were working, but they were happening without coordination or quality control. Some mechanics installed coils correctly and achieved excellent results. Others made wiring mistakes that caused electrical fires or complete ignition failure. A few installations used inappropriate components that failed catastrophically during combat. The success stories were encouraging, but the failures were killing pilots. Colonel Harrison recognized that informal modification programs were becoming dangerous. On April 25th, he issued orders standardizing coil installation procedures across all fighter groups in the 8th Air Force. Every modification would use identical components, follow identical installation procedures, and undergo identical testing before aircraft returned to combat status. Harrison was taking personal responsibility for ensuring that life-saving modifications didn't become life-threatening mistakes. The standardization orders reached Martinez while he was still testing at Republic Aviation. Harrison wanted him to return to England immediately to train mechanics on proper coil installation techniques. Republic wanted him to continue testing until they had enough data to recommend production changes. Martinez faced a choice between completing thorough testing and responding to immediate operational needs. Stevens offered a compromise. Republic would accelerate their testing program and assign additional engineers to work with Martinez. They would complete comprehensive testing within 2 weeks instead of 4. In exchange, Martinez would help Republic develop production procedures that could be implemented at aircraft factories across America. The collaboration would ensure that coil modifications became standard equipment rather than field expedients. Martinez agreed. The next 2 weeks at Republic Aviation were the most intensive testing program in American aviation history. 12 test pilots flew modified P-47 Thunderbolts through conditions designed to break conventional ignition systems. Temperature cycling from -60 to +150 degrees. Altitude tests from sea level to 45,000 feet. G-force testing that subjected aircraft to stresses beyond normal combat limits. The coil systems passed every test. Voltage output remained constant regardless of altitude or temperature. Ignition timing stayed accurate through maneuvers that would have destroyed magneto calibration. Electrical interference was actually lower than conventional systems because coils generated cleaner electromagnetic signatures. Republic's engineers concluded that Martinez had accidentally discovered the ideal ignition system for high-performance aircraft. Production planning began immediately. Republic's manufacturing division calculated that they could produce coil ignition systems for $8.50 per aircraft in quantities of 1,000 units. Installation time would be reduced from 4 hours to 90 minutes because coil systems required fewer precision adjustments than magneto installations. Aircraft factories could implement the change without retooling production lines or retraining assembly workers. But Republic faced competition from other manufacturers who had learned about coil modifications through military channels. Bendix Corporation, original manufacturer of the failed magneto systems, was developing their own electronic ignition using radio tube technology. General Electric was designing solid-state ignition systems using experimental semiconductor components. Delco Remy had proposed adapting their automotive ignition technology for aircraft applications. The competition accelerated development across the entire industry. What had started as one mechanic's desperate field modification was driving technological innovation that would revolutionize both aircraft and automotive electrical systems. Martinez found himself at the center of engineering developments that would influence transportation technology for decades. Stevens offered Martinez a permanent position as Republic's chief ignition system engineer. The job would involve developing electronic ignition for military and civilian aircraft, consulting with automotive manufacturers on high-performance ignition systems, and supervising production of Coil modifications for existing military aircraft. The salary was 5 times his army pay. The opportunity was unprecedented for someone without formal engineering education. Martinez was tempted, but he had made commitments to pilots who were still flying combat missions with failing magneto systems. Every day he spent in Long Island was another day that mechanics in England were installing Coil modifications without proper training or quality control. His first responsibility was to the men who trusted their lives to electrical systems he had taught them to build. On May 8th, Martinez returned to England, carrying Republic's test data and production recommendations. Colonel Harrison had assembled representatives from every fighter group in the 8th Air Force. Martinez would have 3 days to train 42 mechanics on standardized Coil installation procedures. Those mechanics would return to their stations and train others until every fighter aircraft in Britain carried reliable ignition systems. The training program at Bisham was unlike anything in military aviation history. Martinez taught automotive electrical theory to aircraft mechanics who had never worked on civilian vehicles. He demonstrated Coil testing procedures using equipment borrowed from British automotive repair shops. He showed installation techniques that violated traditional aircraft maintenance practices but produced superior results under combat conditions. Some mechanics adapted quickly to the new procedures. Others struggled with concepts that contradicted their formal training. A few resisted the modifications entirely, arguing that unauthorized changes to aircraft electrical systems were inherently dangerous regardless of test results. Martinez had to convince 42 experienced professionals that everything they had learned about aircraft ignition was wrong. The breakthrough came when Lieutenant Morrison addressed the assembled mechanics. He described his combat experience with Coil ignition, the improved engine performance at high altitude, the reliability that had kept him alive during violent combat maneuvering. Morrison's testimony carried weight that no engineering data could match. He was living proof that the modifications worked when pilots needed them most. By May 11th, 38 mechanics had qualified to install Coil ignition systems. 4 had failed the training program, unable to master electrical procedures that required precision beyond their experience. The qualified mechanics returned to their stations with Coil components, installation instructions, and testing equipment needed to modify their entire squadrons. The results were immediate and measurable. Fighter squadrons using Coil ignition reported significant improvements in mission completion rates. Engine-related aborts dropped from 12% to less than 2%. Pilots reported improved engine performance at high altitude and better reliability during combat maneuvering. Most importantly, ignition-related aircraft losses stopped almost completely in squadrons that had implemented the modifications. German intelligence noticed the change within weeks. Luftwaffe pilots reported that American fighters were maintaining formation integrity at altitudes where they had previously struggled. Combat reports mentioned improved American aircraft performance during sustained engagements. German technical intelligence services began examining wreckage from downed American fighters, looking for modifications that explained the performance improvements. On May 18th, German forces recovered the wreckage of a P-51 Mustang that had been shot down over Belgium. The aircraft carried one of Martinez's Coil ignition systems. German engineers examining the wreckage were puzzled by the automotive components installed in a military aircraft. Their analysis concluded that American mechanics were using civilian parts to repair combat damage to aircraft electrical systems. The German assessment was completely wrong, but it influenced Luftwaffe tactics for months afterward. German pilots assumed that American aircraft using civilian replacement parts were mechanically unreliable and would fail under combat stress. They began pressing attacks against American formations, expecting American fighters to develop mechanical problems during extended engagements. The tactic backfired spectacularly. American fighters with Coil ignition systems were more reliable than ever, and German pilots found themselves committed to fights they couldn't disengage from. And Martinez received intelligence reports about German tactical changes through Colonel Harrison. The reports confirmed that Coil modifications were having strategic effects beyond their immediate technical benefits. German fighter tactics were adapting to perceived American weaknesses that no longer existed. American fighters were gaining tactical advantages their pilots didn't even recognize, but the strategic implications would take months to develop fully. The immediate problem was expanding Coil modifications beyond fighter aircraft to the bomber formations that were suffering even higher rates of ignition-related failures. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew longer missions at higher altitudes than fighters. Their magneto systems failed more frequently and with more catastrophic results. When a fighter's ignition system failed, the pilot could usually glide to friendly territory or bail out over water where rescue was possible. When a bomber's ignition failed deep over Germany, 10 crew members faced almost certain death or capture. Bomber crews were demanding Coil modifications with urgency that reflected their desperate situation. Martinez knew that bomber modifications would be more complex than fighter installations. 4-engine aircraft required 4 separate ignition systems operating simultaneously. Installing coils on bombers meant developing new wiring harnesses, new switching systems, new testing procedures. The work would require weeks of development that bomber crews flying missions over Germany couldn't wait for. The solution came from an unexpected source. Boeing Aircraft Company, manufacturer of the B-17 Flying Fortress, had been monitoring reports of Coil modifications through military channels. Boeing's chief engineer, Edward Wells, recognized immediately that electronic ignition could solve reliability problems that had plagued bomber operations since the aircraft entered combat. Wells contacted Martinez directly on May 20th. Boeing wanted to hire him as a consultant to develop Coil ignition systems for production bombers. The contract would allow Martinez to work with Boeing's engineering team while maintaining his military duties. Boeing would handle all development costs and provide technical support for field installations. Martinez accepted Boeing's offer immediately. Working with Boeing's resources would allow him to develop bomber modifications faster and more thoroughly than working alone. Boeing's engineering team could solve technical problems that were beyond Martinez's experience, while he provided practical knowledge that Boeing's engineers lacked. The collaboration between Martinez, Republic Aviation, and Boeing Aircraft represented unprecedented cooperation between military personnel and civilian industry. The partnerships were developing technologies that would revolutionize both military and civilian aviation. But the immediate goal remained simple: keep Allied aircrew alive long enough to win the war. The first Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress to receive Martinez's Coil modification was aircraft 42-97058, nicknamed Memphis Belle by her crew. Staff Sergeant Joe Williams had volunteered his bomber for the experimental installation after losing his No. 3 engine-to-magneto failure over Schweinfurt 2 weeks earlier. The crew had nursed the damaged fortress home on 3 engines, while German fighters circled like vultures. Williams understood that reliable ignition meant the difference between completing 25 missions and dying over occupied Europe. Boeing's engineering team arrived at Bassingbourn Airfield on May 23, 1943. Chief Engineer Edward Wells brought 6 specialists and a truck loaded with electrical testing equipment. They had studied Martinez's fighter modifications through Republic's technical reports, but bombers presented challenges that single-engine aircraft never faced. 4 Wright Cyclone engines meant 4 separate ignition systems that had to work in perfect coordination. Electrical interference between systems could cause cascade failures that would cripple the entire aircraft. Wells examined Memphis Belle's engine bay with the methodical precision of someone who had designed the aircraft from blueprints. The B-17's electrical architecture was more complex than any fighter. Navigation radios, bombing equipment, defensive armament, and communication systems all shared the same electrical bus. Adding 4 high-voltage coil systems to that network required careful engineering to prevent interference that could blind the bombardier or silence the radio operator at critical moments. Martinez explained his modification philosophy while Wells took notes: simplicity over complexity, reliability over precision, higher voltage to overcome adverse conditions rather than mechanical timing that failed when conditions deteriorated. The principles that worked for fighters would work for bombers, but the implementation required scaling up from 1 engine to 4. The installation took 3 days. Boeing's engineers mounted coils behind each engine's firewall, positioned to minimize electromagnetic interference with radio equipment. They ran dedicated wiring harnesses from the main electrical panel to each coil, with manual switches that allowed the flight engineer to control each engine's ignition system independently. If one coil failed, the other 3 would continue operating. If magneto systems failed, the flight engineer could switch all 4 engines to coil ignition with a single motion. Technical Sergeant Robert Chen, Memphis Bell's flight engineer, watched every step of the installation process. 26 years old, mechanical engineering degree from MIT before the war, Chen understood electrical systems better than most Boeing engineers. He asked detailed questions about voltage regulation, timing control, and failure modes. Chen would be responsible for operating the coil systems during combat missions. His understanding of the technology could determine whether his crew survived encounters with German fighters. The test flight launched on May 26th at 0630 hours. Memphis Bell climbed to 25,000 feet, carrying a full bomb load, simulating combat mission conditions. Chen monitored engine parameters while pilot Captain Robert Morgan pushed the aircraft through maneuvers that stressed the ignition systems. Power changes from cruise to combat settings, rapid altitude changes that altered atmospheric pressure, banking turns that subjected the electrical systems to G-forces that would have disrupted magneto timing. The coil systems performed flawlessly. Engine response was immediate and consistent regardless of power setting or altitude. Chen reported that ignition timing remained stable through maneuvers that would have caused magneto drift in conventional installations. Most importantly, all 4 engines maintained synchronization throughout the flight. The coil modification had eliminated the timing variations that forced bomber crews to constantly adjust throttle settings to keep engines running smoothly. Wells flew as an observer on the test flight, monitoring electromagnetic interference with a portable radio receiver. He had been concerned that high-voltage coils would disrupt radio communications or navigation equipment. The tests showed no measurable interference. Coil systems actually generated cleaner electrical signatures than magnetos because electronic switching eliminated the mechanical arcing that created radio static in conventional ignition systems. Memphis Bell landed after 4 hours of intensive testing. Morgan climbed out of the pilot's seat grinning like a man who had discovered buried treasure. The aircraft had never flown better, he said. Engine response was crisp and immediate. Power settings remained stable without constant adjustment. The bomber felt more responsive, more controllable than any B-17 he had ever flown. Chen's assessment was more technical, but equally enthusiastic. The coil systems provided precise ignition timing that never varied regardless of engine speed or atmospheric conditions. Voltage output remained constant from sea level to maximum altitude. The electrical load on the aircraft's main bus was actually lower than conventional magneto systems because coils drew power more efficiently. Wells documented every aspect of the test flight in preparation for his report to Boeing's executive committee. The coil modification exceeded performance specifications in every category: reliability, efficiency, power output, electromagnetic compatibility. Boeing could implement the modification in production aircraft immediately without additional development time, but Wells understood the broader implications beyond technical performance. Memphis Belle was scheduled to complete her 25th combat mission in 3 weeks. If she survived that final mission, her crew would return to the United States as heroes. The first B-17 crew to complete a full combat tour. Their survival would depend partly on the ignition systems Martinez had designed using automotive parts that cost less than $20. The success of Memphis Belle's test flight accelerated Coil adoption across the 8th Air Force. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding officer of the 305th Bombardment Group, ordered immediate installation of Coil systems on every B-17 under his command. LeMay was a combat veteran who measured success by mission completion rates and crew survival statistics. If Coil modifications improved both categories, he would implement them regardless of regulatory approval. Martinez found himself coordinating modifications across multiple aircraft types simultaneously. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, even transport planes were receiving Coil ignition systems. Each installation required custom engineering because no two aircraft had identical electrical architectures. What had started as a simple magneto replacement was becoming a comprehensive redesign of Allied aviation electrical systems. The workload was overwhelming for one technical sergeant working with borrowed tools and salvaged components. Martinez needed assistance from mechanics who understood both automotive electrical systems and aircraft maintenance procedures. He began training selected personnel from each bombardment group, creating a network of specialists who could install and maintain Coil systems without direct supervision. Staff Sergeant Mike O'Sullivan from the 91st Bombardment Group was Martinez's first student for bomber modifications. O'Sullivan had worked as an automotive electrician in Detroit before the war. He understood ignition timing, voltage regulation, and electrical troubleshooting better than most aircraft mechanics. More importantly, he had lost friends to magneto failures and was motivated to prevent future casualties. Martinez taught O'Sullivan the installation procedures during a week-long training program at Bassingbourn. They modified 3 B-17s together, with Martinez explaining the theory while O'Sullivan performed the actual work. By the end of the week, O'Sullivan could install Coil systems as efficiently as Martinez himself. He returned to his squadron with components and instructions to modify every bomber in the 91st Bombardment Group. Similar training programs began at bomber bases across England. Martinez travelled from station to station, teaching Coil installation to mechanics who would train others. The knowledge spread through informal networks faster than official approval processes could track. By June 1943, hundreds of Allied aircraft were flying combat missions with ignition systems that existed nowhere in technical manuals. German intelligence was beginning to notice patterns in Allied aircraft performance that suggested systematic modifications to propulsion systems. Luftwaffe technical analysis units examined wreckage from increasing numbers of downed Allied aircraft carrying non-standard electrical components. The pattern was too consistent to represent field repairs using civilian parts. The modifications appeared to be intentional improvements to aircraft systems. Oberst Heinrich Bauer commanded the Luftwaffe's Technical Intelligence Division. His analysts had identified Coil ignition systems in wreckage from American fighters and bombers shot down across occupied Europe. The components were clearly automotive in origin, but their installation showed engineering sophistication that contradicted assumptions about field-expedient repairs. Bauer concluded that American aircraft were receiving systematic electrical system upgrades that improved their combat effectiveness. Bauer's intelligence reports reached Hermann Göring's headquarters in early June. The Reichsmarshal was concerned that American aircraft modifications represented technological advantages that German industry couldn't match. He ordered immediate development of similar ignition improvements for Luftwaffe fighters. German engineers began reverse engineering captured Coil systems to understand the principles behind their superior performance. The German response was exactly what Martinez had hoped to avoid. His modifications were supposed to be invisible improvements that enhanced Allied aircraft performance without alerting enemy intelligence services. Instead, the Coil systems were becoming so widespread that German forces were capturing examples regularly. The technological advantage was temporary, lasting only until German engineers developed similar systems for their own aircraft. But Martinez understood that temporary advantages could be decisive in warfare. Every month that Allied aircraft flew with superior ignition systems, while German aircraft struggled with conventional magnetos, represented hundreds of missions that might otherwise have failed. Bomber crews completing tours with Coil-equipped aircraft were surviving to train replacement crews. Fighter pilots, with reliable ignition systems, were achieving kill ratios that degraded German pilot experience levels. The strategic implications extended beyond individual aircraft performance. Reliable ignition systems allowed Allied air commanders to plan longer missions, deeper penetrations into German airspace, more aggressive tactics that exploited electrical system advantages. Mission planning no longer had to account for predictable ignition failures that forced formations to abort attacks or return home with partial bomb loads. General Ira Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, received reports of improved mission success rates from every group using Coil modifications. Aircraft availability was higher because fewer bombers were grounded for magneto maintenance. Mission completion rates improved because ignition failures no longer forced aircraft to abort over target areas. Most importantly, crew survival rates were increasing as aircraft returned home instead of crashing due to engine failures. Eaker authorized formal adoption of Coil ignition systems on June 15, 1943. His order made Martinez's modifications official policy for all 8th Air Force aircraft. Engineering commands were directed to procure components, develop installation procedures, and train maintenance personnel on Coil system operation. What had been unauthorized field modifications became standard equipment overnight. The authorization solved regulatory problems but created logistical challenges. The 8th Air Force needed thousands of Coil systems immediately. American automotive manufacturers were operating at maximum capacity, producing equipment for military vehicles. Aircraft manufacturers were building planes as fast as possible using conventional ignition systems. Nobody had anticipated demand for automotive coils in aviation applications. Republic Aviation offered to manufacture Coil systems at their Long Island facility using production techniques developed during Martinez's testing program. Boeing committed to installing Coil systems on new B-17s before they left the factory. Other manufacturers began developing similar capabilities, but production would take months to reach full capacity. Meanwhile, combat operations continued with aircraft that needed reliable ignition systems immediately. Martinez proposed a temporary solution that shocked procurement officers. The Army could purchase automotive coils from civilian parts suppliers and install them using field modification procedures he had already developed. The approach would provide immediate improvements to aircraft reliability while manufacturers developed production capabilities for military specification systems. The proposal violated standard procurement procedures that required military equipment to meet stringent specifications before installation on combat aircraft. Automotive coils were designed for civilian applications with different reliability requirements, different operating environments, different maintenance schedules. Using civilian components on military aircraft created legal liability issues that procurement officers were reluctant to accept. Colonel Harrison supported Martinez's proposal at a meeting of 8th Air Force procurement officials on June 18th. Harrison presented combat statistics showing dramatic improvements in aircraft reliability among squadrons using Coil modifications. He argued that immediate implementation of proven modifications was more important than waiting for military specification systems that might not be available for months. The meeting lasted 6 hours. Procurement officers raised dozens of objections to using civilian components on military aircraft. Quality control concerns, warranty issues, maintenance complications, supply chain reliability. Each objection was valid, but none addressed the fundamental problem that conventional magneto systems were killing Allied aircrew at unsustainable rates. Martinez sat quietly through most of the meeting, listening to discussions about regulations and procedures while thinking about pilots who were flying combat missions that afternoon with ignition systems that might fail when they needed power most. Finally, he requested permission to speak. His statement was brief and direct. Automotive coils work better than aircraft magnetos under combat conditions. I can prove it with test data from Republic Aviation and combat reports from every squadron using the modifications. We can install them immediately using procedures I've already developed, or we can wait for military specification systems while pilots die from preventable ignition failures. The choice is between saving lives and following regulations. General Eaker made the decision personally. The 8th Air Force would procure automotive coils immediately from civilian suppliers. Installation would begin within 1 week using Martinez's field modification procedures. Military specification systems would be developed in parallel, but combat operations couldn't wait for perfect solutions when good solutions were available immediately. The procurement order was unprecedented in military aviation history. The Army Air Forces contracted with Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Chrysler Corporation, and dozens of smaller automotive suppliers to provide ignition coils for aircraft applications. The contracts specified automotive-grade components with no modifications for military use. Installation would be performed by aircraft mechanics using procedures developed by a technical sergeant working with salvaged parts. Ford's Dearborn plant received the largest contract. Henry Ford personally approved emergency production runs of Model A ignition coils specifically for military aircraft applications. Ford engineers were amazed that their automotive components were being used to improve the performance of advanced fighter planes and heavy bombers. The technical crossover between automotive and aviation applications was creating innovations in both industries. Martinez returned to Botisham on June 22nd to find that his modification program had grown beyond anything he had imagined. Mechanics from across the 8th Air Force were arriving daily for training on coil installation procedures. Aircraft manufacturers were sending engineers to study his techniques. Automotive suppliers were delivering truckloads of components that would be installed on aircraft worth millions of dollars. The scale of the operation required systematic organization that Martinez had never attempted. He needed training facilities, testing equipment, quality control procedures, documentation systems, and supply chain management. The informal modification program was becoming an industrial operation that required skills beyond his experience as an aircraft mechanic. Boeing's Edward Wells offered to provide organizational support for the expanded modification program. Boeing would assign project management specialists to coordinate training, procurement, and installation activities. Martinez would continue providing technical leadership while Boeing handled administrative complexities that were beyond the scope of military maintenance operations. The partnership between Martinez and Boeing represented unprecedented cooperation between enlisted personnel and civilian industry. A technical sergeant was directing engineering activities at one of America's largest aircraft manufacturers. Boeing executives were taking technical direction from a mechanic who had learned electrical systems by working on racing cars in Los Angeles garages. Wells understood that Martinez possessed practical knowledge that Boeing's engineering department couldn't replicate. Martinez had discovered ignition system improvements through direct experience with combat aircraft operating under conditions that no engineering laboratory could simulate. His modifications worked because they solved real problems that conventional engineering had failed to address. The collaboration produced innovations that neither military nor civilian organizations could have developed independently. Martinez's practical experience combined with Boeing's engineering resources created ignition systems that exceeded the performance of either automotive or aircraft components used separately. The hybrid approach was generating technological advances that would influence both industries for decades. By the end of June 1943, more than 800 Allied aircraft were flying combat missions with coil ignition systems based on Martinez's original modification. Fighter squadrons reported improved performance at high altitude. Bomber groups achieved mission success rates that exceeded pre-war planning assumptions. Most importantly, ignition-related aircraft losses had virtually disappeared in units using the modifications. The success created new challenges that Martinez had never anticipated. Other Allied air forces wanted coil modifications for their aircraft. The Royal Air Force requested technical assistance for installing coil systems on British fighters and bombers. Soviet Air Force representatives inquired about obtaining coil components through Lend-Lease agreements. Even the Chinese Air Force expressed interest in modifications that could improve the reliability of their American-supplied aircraft. International implementation would require diplomatic agreements, technology transfer protocols, and manufacturing arrangements that extended far beyond Martinez's original modification program. The simple coil installation that had saved Lieutenant Morrison's life over the North Sea was becoming a strategic technology that could influence the outcome of air campaigns across multiple theatres of war. Martinez realized that his informal modification program had evolved into something much larger than keeping individual pilots alive. The coil ignition systems were becoming standard equipment that would define Allied aviation technology for the remainder of the war. His desperate attempt to solve one squadron's ignition problems was changing how every Allied air force approached aircraft electrical system design. The transformation from field expedient to strategic technology was accelerating faster than anyone had anticipated. What happened next would determine whether Martinez's innovations remained temporary combat modifications or became permanent advances in aviation technology that would influence aircraft design long after the war ended. But the rapid expansion created problems Martinez hadn't foreseen. Quality control became impossible when hundreds of mechanics were installing coil systems using hand-copied instructions and improvised techniques. Staff Sergeant Frank DeMarco at Thurley reported 3 B-24 Liberators that had suffered electrical fires during coil installation. The fires were caused by incorrect wire gauge selection and improper grounding procedures. 2 aircraft were destroyed. 1 crew member was hospitalized with severe burns. Technical Sergeant William Hayes at Grafton Underwood discovered that automotive coils from different manufacturers had incompatible mounting dimensions. Ford coils required different bracket configurations than General Motors units. Chrysler coils used different electrical connections than Delco components. Hayes had to design custom installation procedures for each coil type, multiplying the complexity of what Martinez had intended as a simple, standardized modification. The supply chain was fragmenting as demand exceeded automotive industry capacity. Ford's Dearborn plant was producing coils as fast as possible, but military orders were competing with civilian, automotive production that supported the broader war effort. Automotive suppliers were prioritizing military contracts, but civilian mechanics needed coils to maintain trucks, jeeps, and staff cars that kept military bases operational. The coil shortage was creating cascading effects across multiple industries. Martinez received urgent messages from bomber crews whose aircraft were grounded waiting for coil components. Captain William Ross, pilot of B-17 Sweet Caroline, reported that his squadron had completed coil installations on 8 aircraft but lacked components for the remaining 4 bombers. Ross was scheduled to lead a mission against submarine pens at Saint-Nazaire in 3 days. Half his formation would fly with reliable coil ignition, while the other half risked magneto failures over occupied France. The partial implementation was creating tactical problems that air commanders hadn't anticipated. Mixed formations of aircraft with different ignition systems couldn't maintain formation integrity when some planes struggled with altitude performance, while others operated at peak efficiency. Squadron leaders found themselves adjusting mission profiles to accommodate the lowest performing aircraft, negating the advantages that coil systems provided to properly equipped planes. Colonel LeMay contacted Martinez directly on July 2nd. The 305th Bombardment Group needed immediate solutions for standardizing coil installations across all aircraft types. LeMay had authorized his engineering officer to work directly with Martinez, bypassing normal procurement channels that were too slow for combat operations. The engineering officer, Major Thomas Chen, was authorized to requisition components from any available source and implement modifications using any procedures that produced reliable results. Chen arrived at Bottisham on July 4th, carrying orders that gave him unprecedented authority to modify aircraft ignition systems. He brought a team of 6 specialists and portable testing equipment that allowed precise measurement of coil performance under simulated combat conditions. Chen's mission was to solve the quality control problems that were threatening the entire modification program. Major Chen had earned a mechanical engineering degree from Caltech before the war. He understood both automotive and aircraft electrical systems well enough to recognize why Martinez's modifications worked better than conventional magneto installations. But Chen also understood the engineering discipline required to convert successful field expedients into reliable production systems that could be manufactured and maintained by personnel with varying skill levels. Chen spent 2 days examining coil installations at different bomber bases, documenting the variations in procedures, components, and results that had developed as the modification program expanded. Some installations were masterpieces of electrical engineering that improved aircraft performance dramatically. Others were dangerous approximations that created fire hazards and electromagnetic interference problems. The variation was inevitable when complex modifications were implemented by mechanics with different backgrounds, training levels, and available resources. Martinez had developed his original procedures through trial and error over several weeks. Mechanics attempting to replicate his work from second-hand instructions were making mistakes that Martinez had learned to avoid through experience. Chen proposed systematic standardization that would eliminate the variations causing quality problems. Standard components from approved suppliers, standard installation procedures with detailed technical illustrations, standard testing protocols that verified proper operation before aircraft returned to combat status, standard training programs that ensured all mechanics understood both the procedures and the underlying principles. The standardization program would take 6 weeks to implement fully. During that time, aircraft with properly installed coil systems would continue operating, while aircraft with questionable installations would be grounded for reinspection and correction. Chen estimated that approximately 30% of existing coil installations would require modification or replacement to meet safety standards. Martinez supported Chen's proposal despite the operational disruption it would cause. Better to ground aircraft temporarily for proper installation than to lose crews to electrical failures caused by incorrect modifications. The systematic approach would take longer than continuing informal installations, but it would produce reliable results that could be maintained by any qualified mechanic. The collaboration between Martinez and Major Chen represented the transition from field expedient to engineering standard. Martinez provided practical knowledge gained from months of combat experience. Chen contributed systematic engineering discipline that could scale the modifications across thousands of aircraft without compromising safety or reliability. Boeing's Edward Wells integrated Chen's standardization requirements into Republic Aviation's production planning. Boeing would manufacture coil mounting brackets to precise specifications that eliminated the compatibility problems Hayes had discovered. Republic would produce wiring harnesses that simplified installation and reduced the possibility of electrical errors. Other manufacturers would contribute specialized components that collectively created a complete ignition system rather than individual parts requiring custom integration. The industrial cooperation was unprecedented in wartime production. Multiple companies were sharing engineering data, coordinating production schedules, and developing compatible components for a system that had originated from one mechanic's desperate improvisation. The competitive relationships that normally characterized American industry were suspended to produce ignition systems that would keep Allied aircrew alive. Automotive suppliers were learning aircraft reliability requirements, while aircraft manufacturers studied automotive cost control techniques. Ford engineers visited Boeing facilities to understand how their coils would be installed in bomber electrical systems. Boeing specialists traveled to Detroit to observe automotive production methods that could be adapted for aircraft component manufacturing. The technology transfer was generating innovations in both industries. Automotive coils designed for aircraft applications incorporated reliability improvements that enhanced civilian vehicle performance. Aircraft electrical systems benefited from automotive cost reduction techniques that made complex electronics economically viable for widespread installation. Bobby Martinez never received a medal for saving thousands of Allied airmen with a 2-shilling Ford Coil. He returned to Los Angeles after the war, opened an automotive repair shop, and rarely spoke about his modifications. But every P-51 Mustang, every B-17 Flying Fortress, every Allied fighter that outperformed German aircraft carried his innovation into combat. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs come not from engineering laboratories or corporate boardrooms, but from mechanics who refuse to watch good people die from preventable failures.